Think, for a moment, about the device you might be listening on. A phone, a tablet, a computer. It feels effortless, an extension of your thoughts. With a simple touch, you can work, create, connect, and be entertained. This seamless flow of information, this quiet symphony of light and code, has become as natural to us as the air we breathe. But this reality, the one we take for granted, is incredibly new. If we were to travel back just 50 years, the world would be almost unrecognizable from a technological standpoint. The very idea of a personal computer was the stuff of science fiction. Computers did exist, of course, but they were not personal. They were monolithic beasts, giants of metal and wire that filled entire rooms, humming with a power that was both mysterious and inaccessible. They lived in the sterile, air-conditioned halls of universities, government agencies, and vast corporations, operated not by everyday people, but by a high priesthood of engineers in white lab coats. They were tools for calculating missile trajectories or managing corporate payrolls. They were not for you or me. And then everything changed. The change was not a single event, but the result of a quiet revolution sparked by two young men who saw the future in a grain of sand. Their names were Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. One was an artist, a visionary who pursued perfection with a relentless, almost spiritual fervor. He believed technology should not just be functional, but beautiful, intuitive, and capable of elevating the human spirit. He wanted to build not just a tool, but a work of art. The other was an architect, a pragmatist, a brilliant strategist who understood that the true power of a machine lay not in its hardware, but in the invisible language that brought it to life. He wanted to write the code that would become the universal operating system for the entire world. For a brief, shining moment in the dawn of the personal computer age, these two men were allies. Their companies worked together, their talents complementing each other perfectly. But the very technology they helped create, with its immense potential for wealth and influence, would eventually drive a wedge between them. Their alliance would curdle into one of an epic and bitter rivalry, a feud that would define an entire generation. The conflict became intensely personal. Steve Jobs, in a moment of incandescent rage, would call Bill Gates shameless, a man with no taste who simply ripped off other people's ideas. Bill Gates, in his own cool and analytical way, would later describe their dynamic with the now famous metaphor, casting them both as two thieves breaking into the same house, only to find the other had gotten there first. So, what happened? What was the spark that ignited this fire? How did these two pioneers, once partners in a revolution, become such entrenched and bitter adversaries? To find the answer, we do not need to rush. Let us, together, in the stillness of this moment, drift back in time. We will trace the story from its very beginning, step by step, and understand how two remarkable individuals, two competing philosophies, and one shared dream would forever change the world. Welcome to Thanh Labs, where we transform dry, complex financial stories into soothing sleep experiences, using sleep psychology and sound therapy to help you drift into deep, effortless rest. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share this video. It really means a lot, keeps me going on this journey. Sleep deep, learn passively, and wake up wealthier. Part 1. The pioneers. Before we can understand the rivalry, we must first understand the world that created it. The world before the personal computer. In the era before the 1970s, the concept of owning a computer was as fanciful as owning a private spaceship. The machines of the day, known as mainframes, were colossal entities. Imagine a room filled with towering metal cabinets, connected by a jungle of thick cables under a raised floor. The air would be cool and sterile, filled with the constant hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic clatter of tape drives spinning back and forth. To communicate with these giants, you didn't use a screen and a keyboard. You used punch cards, meticulously prepared stacks of paper with holes that represented lines of code. A single misplaced hole could ruin an entire day's work. These machines were owned by institutions like IBM, and they were leased, not sold, for astronomical sums. They were the exclusive domain of the powerful and the highly educated. But deep within the laboratories of the technology industry, a fundamental shift was occurring. Scientists and engineers were on a quest for miniaturization. They were learning how to etch complex electrical circuits onto tiny slivers of silicon. This led to a breakthrough invention that would change everything. It was called the microprocessor. In the early 1970s, a company named Intel introduced the first commercially available microprocessor. It was a marvel of engineering. They had managed to shrink the entire central processing unit, the brain of a computer, onto a single tiny chip, no bigger than a child's fingernail. This single innovation was the seed from which the entire personal computer industry would grow. It suddenly made it possible for smaller, more affordable machines to be built. One of the very first companies to seize this opportunity was a small, obscure firm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, called wits. In 1974, they used Intel's new chip to create a kit computer they called the Altair 8800. The Altair was a revolution, but it was still a far cry from the computers we know today. It arrived as a box of parts. To use it, you first had to be an expert with a soldering iron. You had to assemble the circuit boards yourself, painstakingly connecting hundreds of tiny components. Once it was built, it had no keyboard and no screen. Its only interface was a panel of toggle switches and a row of flashing red lights. You had to input your programs in binary code, one bit at a time, by flipping these switches up and down. It was a machine that could do very little, but it represented a world of possibility. It was not a tool for the masses. It was a siren call to a new kind of enthusiast, the hobbyist, the tinkerer, the electronics nerd. And across the country, in garages and basements, these pioneers began to gather, forming clubs to share their knowledge and show off their creations. Amid this burgeoning wave of technological excitement, one young man saw an opportunity to do something more. His name was Steve, but not the one you might be thinking of first. This was Steve Wozniak. Wozniak, or Woz, as his friends called him, was a purebred engineer. He was a prodigy, a wizard with circuits and code. He grew up in the heart of what would become Silicon Valley, in a family steeped in engineering. His father worked for the prestigious defense contractor Lockheed Martin, and from a very young age, Wozniak was captivated by electronics. He spent countless hours by his father's side, learning the elegant logic of circuits, building his own gadgets from scratch. For Wozniak, technology was not a business. It was a passion, an art form. By 1975, Wozniak was working at Hewlett-Packard, or HP, a respected engineering company. By day, he designed calculators, but by night, in his small apartment, he was dreaming of something much bigger. He was a regular at the local homebrew computer club, a legendary gathering of hobbyists where the Altair and other home-built machines were a source of endless fascination. Wozniak wanted to build his own computer, but he had a different vision. He wanted to create a machine that was not just for experts, but was truly for everyone. So, he got to work. In his spare time, he designed and built a new kind of computer board. It was elegant, efficient, and had one feature that was truly revolutionary for its time. He proudly showed his latest creation to a close friend. This friend was also named Steve, and this time it was Steve Jobs. Jobs was, in almost every way, the mirror opposite of Wozniak. While Wozniak was a quiet, unassuming engineer who loved the process of creation, Jobs was a charismatic, intense visionary who was obsessed with a final product. He had worked odd jobs, designed video games for Atari, and had even traveled to India on a spiritual quest. Jobs wasn't an engineer in the traditional sense. He couldn't design a circuit board from scratch. But he had something Wozniak lacked, an uncanny intuition for what people wanted, a burning ambition, and a relentless drive to turn ideas into reality. When Jobs saw Wozniak's creation, he was stunned. The computer board was still primitive, but it did one magical thing. When you typed a letter on a connected keyboard, that letter instantly appeared on a connected television screen. Today, this sounds utterly mundane. It's the most basic function of a computer. But in 1975, in a world of toggle switches and blinking lights, to see your own words appear on a screen in real time was like witnessing magic. Wozniak saw his invention as a fun project. He had no intention of selling it. He just wanted to share it with his friends at the computer club. But Jobs saw something else entirely. He saw a business. He saw a future. He saw an opportunity to take Wozniak's brilliant engineering and package it for the world. And so, in the most humble of settings, their journey began. They had no office, no factory, no capital. Their headquarters was the cluttered garage of Steve Jobs' parents' home in Los Altos, California. To raise their initial funds, Jobs sold his beloved Volkswagen van, and Wozniak, with a heavy heart, sold his prized HP programmable calculator. They needed a name for their new company. Jobs, who had recently returned from working at an apple orchard in Oregon, suggested a name that was simple, friendly, and completely different from the technical, acronym-heavy names of the day. And so, Apple Computer was born. In 1976, the Apple I was officially released at a price of $666.66. It was a pioneering product, but it was still very much a device for hobbyists. It was just a single circuit board. To use it, you had to supply your own keyboard, your own power supply, and your own monitor, which, for most people, meant an old television set. It was a step forward, but it was not yet a product for the masses. Still, it found a dedicated audience. Jobs and Wozniak hand-assembled about 200 units in that garage and sold them all. But they knew this was not enough. If Apple was going to truly change the world, they needed something far more ambitious. In Jobs' mind, a vision was forming for a completely new machine, a computer that required no assembly, a computer that worked right out of the box, and most importantly, a computer that felt like a friendly home appliance, something anyone would be proud to have on their desk. Buoyed by the modest success of the Apple I, Jobs secured a crucial investment of $91,000 from a former Intel executive named Mike Markula, who also helped them secure a $250,000 line of credit. With real funding behind them, they set out to build their masterpiece. The new machine, the Apple II, was a quantum leap forward. It was designed to be a complete, self-contained unit. For the first time, a personal computer came with a built-in keyboard and was housed in an elegant, custom-designed plastic case. It came with its own power supply. It could be hooked up to any television, and, in a move that was truly groundbreaking for the time, it had a color display. For Jobs, the aesthetics were as important as the engineering. A crude metal box, like the other computers on the market, would not do. He wanted something sleek, professional, and approachable. After many iterations, they settled on a friendly, beige-colored case with gentle, curved edges. On June 10, 1977, the Apple II was officially launched. It was an instant sensation. No longer a product just for tech geeks. The Apple II became the first personal computer to truly capture the imagination of the general public. It found its way into homes, schools, and small businesses. Jobs and Wozniak were no longer just two guys in a garage. They were now at the very forefront of the technology race. Part 2. The unlikely alliance success, as it often does, brings both reward and challenge. The Apple II became a cultural phenomenon, but its very popularity created a powerful gravitational pull, drawing a host of competitors into its orbit. In 1977, the same year the Apple II was launched, the personal computer market exploded. Companies like Commodore, with its PET computer, and Radio Shack, with its Tandy TRS-80, rushed to release their own machines. This trio, Apple, Commodore, and Tandy, became known as the 1977 Trinity. But these new competitors had a significant advantage. They were cheaper. While Apple pursued a philosophy of premium design and a higher price point, other companies focused on cutting costs to make their machines more accessible. As these rivals flooded the market with more affordable options, Apple's market share began to feel the pressure. Steve Jobs knew that if Apple was to maintain its leadership position, he needed more than just beautiful hardware. The Apple II needed a killer app, a piece of software so compelling that people would buy the computer just to run it. He needed a way to transform the Apple II from a machine for hobbyists and students into an indispensable tool for business. And to do that, he had to make a deal with a man who would one day become his greatest rival. 2 years before the Apple II's debut, another pair of young, ambitious friends were making their own waves in the nascent tech world. Bill Gates and Paul Allen, two programming prodigies from Seattle, had seen the same future that Jobs and Wozniak had. But while Apple focused on building the physical machine, the hardware Gates and Allen chose a different path. Their domain was the invisible world of software. From a young age, Bill Gates was different. Born into a wealthy and influential family in Seattle, he was intensely competitive, brilliant, and single-minded. He had access to computers from an early age, at a time when that was exceedingly rare. As a teenager, he and Allen spent countless hours honing their skills, mastering the complex languages of these giant machines. In 1974, when they saw an article about the Altair 8800 on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine, they knew their moment had arrived. The Altair was a metal box with flashing lights. It had no keyboard, no screen, and most importantly, no software. It couldn't do anything. Gates and Allen realized that for the Altair to be truly useful, it needed a programming language. This was their one in a million shot. They immediately called wits the creators of the Altair, and boldly claimed they had written a version of the popular programming language, BASIC, that could run on the machine. This was a lie. They hadn't written a single line of code. They didn't even have an Altair to test it on. But their bluff worked. Mitas was intrigued and invited them to Albuquerque for a demonstration. For the next 8 weeks, Gates and Allen worked feverishly, often sleeping at the lab, to write the code from scratch based only on published specifications of the Intel chip. Allen flew to New Mexico for the demo, loading the program from a fragile paper tape. Incredibly, it worked perfectly on the very first try. This triumph led Gates to make a decision that would alter the course of his life. He dropped out of Harvard. In 1975, he and Allen moved to Albuquerque and founded a small company in a strip mall. They called it Microsoft. Their initial focus was developing software for the Altair and other early microcomputers. But Gates had a much grander vision. He didn't just want to write software. He wanted Microsoft to become the foundational pillar of the entire computer industry. In 1977, his golden opportunity appeared. The problem with the Apple II was clear. It was powerful and user-friendly, but it lacked the kind of business-oriented software that would make it a serious, professional tool. The world of business ran on spreadsheets and word processors. Gates knew that if he could get those applications running on the Apple II, he could transform it into a must-have machine for offices everywhere and make a fortune in the process. And so, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, the artist and the architect, joined forces. Microsoft quickly developed a suite of business applications for the Apple II, including a version of the basic programming language called AppleSoft. This software allowed the Apple II to handle complex calculations, organize data, and create documents. With Microsoft's software, the Apple II was no longer just a device for playing games or learning to code. The partnership was a monumental success for both companies, thanks in large part to Microsoft's software. Sales of the Apple II skyrocketed. From just a few thousand units in 1977, sales exploded into the hundreds of thousands. By the end of the decade, Apple was no longer a startup. It was a titan of the new technology industry, culminating in a wildly successful IPO in 1980 that made its founders astonishingly wealthy. Microsoft, too, reaped enormous benefits. AppleSoft became one of its best-selling products, providing a massive influx of revenue that transformed the company from a small software shop into a formidable force. At one point, Bill Gates would joke that he had more people working on Apple products than Steve Jobs did. But Gates was not satisfied with being just an ally to Apple. His ambition was limitless. He had his sights set on an even bigger prize: the sleeping giant of the technology world, IBM. If one name could shake the entire computer industry to its core, it was IBM, nicknamed Big Blue. The company had dominated the world of mainframe computing for decades. When IBM announced in the early 1980s that it was finally entering the personal computer market, every other company knew the game was about to change. But IBM, a hardware company through and through, had a major problem. It needed an operating system. Gates saw his chance. He knew IBM's strengths and weaknesses intimately. When IBM approached Microsoft, they were initially just looking for a programming language. But Gates, with his strategic foresight, convinced them that a complete operating system was the most critical piece of the puzzle. There was just one problem. Microsoft didn't have an operating system. But that didn't matter. Gates, ever the pragmatist, knew exactly what to do. He found a small, Seattle-based company that had developed a basic operating system called QDOS, which stood for Quick and Dirty Operating System. Microsoft purchased it outright for around $50,000, polished it up, and renamed it MS-DOS. It was ready for IBM. But the true genius of the deal was not in providing the software, but in the terms of the contract. Gates negotiated a licensing agreement that was nothing short of brilliant. Microsoft did not sell MS-DOS exclusively to IBM. Instead, they licensed it on a per-copy basis. And crucially, they retained the right to license that same operating system to any other computer manufacturer who wanted it. At the time, IBM didn't recognize the strategic importance of software. They were a hardware company, and they saw the operating system as a minor component. This single decision inadvertently unleashed a monster. Soon, other companies began building their own IBM-compatible computers, or clones. And every single one of those machines needed an operating system. And the only operating system available was MS-DOS. In just a few years, Microsoft became a software empire. Money poured into its coffers with every PC sold, regardless of who made the hardware. Bill Gates had achieved his goal. He wasn't just a part of the industry. He was now its central, indispensable foundation. Meanwhile, from his gleaming new headquarters in Cupertino, Steve Jobs watched the meteoric rise of Bill Gates with a growing sense of unease. The stage was being set for a confrontation. Part 3. The Two Thieves at Xerox in 1981. When the IBM PC hit the market, Apple was suddenly on the defensive. The IBM machine, powered by Microsoft's operating system, was a formidable competitor. It was also significantly cheaper. Steve Jobs understood that if Apple didn't make a bold new move, IBM would devour its market share. But he didn't want to simply create a better version of the Apple II. He needed a quantum leap, something that would redefine the very concept of a personal computer. The opportunity came from a completely unexpected source. At the time, Xerox was one of the largest and most respected technology corporations in the world, famous for its photocopiers. They were looking to invest in the burgeoning personal computer market and offered to buy a stake in Apple. But Jobs wasn't interested in their money. He was interested in their secrets. With a masterful piece of negotiation, Jobs convinced Xerox to give him and his team a private tour of their legendary research and development center, Xerox Park. The Palo Alto Research Center was a kind of technological wonderland, a place where Xerox had assembled some of the brightest minds in the world and given them the freedom to invent the future. When Jobs walked through its doors, he had no idea he was about to see something that would change his life and the entire computer industry forever. In a corner of the lab, a researcher showed him a computer called the Xerox Alto. This was no ordinary machine. It didn't use the cryptic, text-based command lines of MS-DOS or the Apple II. Instead, it had a complete graphical user interface, or GUI. On the screen were small pictures or icons that represented files and programs. A file looked like a folder. A document looked like a piece of paper. A trash can icon was used to delete things. And most magically of all, you didn't have to type commands. You could control everything by moving a small handheld device across the desk, which in turn moved a pointer on the screen. It was called a mouse. Jobs was mesmerized. He was, in his own words, blinded by the light. This was it. This was the future. This was how computers were meant to be used. He couldn't believe that Xerox was just sitting on this revolutionary technology, not commercializing it. He returned to Apple a changed man, filled with a messianic zeal. He immediately assembled his best engineers, pulled them off other projects, and gave them a single, all-consuming mission to create a computer with a perfect graphical user interface inspired by what he had seen at Xerox. But Jobs didn't just want to copy the Alto. He wanted to perfect it. He wanted to make it affordable and elegant. The mouse Xerox used, for example, was a clunky 3-button device that cost hundreds of dollars to produce. Jobs demanded a simple, elegant, single-button mouse that could be manufactured for a fraction of the cost. His team delivered, and in the process, invented the concept of the double-click. This new project, this machine that would embody his vision for the future, was named after his favorite type of Apple, the Macintosh. To build the software for this revolutionary new machine, Jobs once again turned to his old partner, Bill Gates. During their collaboration, Gates got his first look at the Macintosh prototype. He was immediately captivated. An operating system where you could drag and drop files, open multiple windows at once, all with a few clicks of a mouse. He saw the same future that Jobs had seen at Xerox. Gates agreed to have Microsoft write applications, like a spreadsheet and a word processor for the Macintosh. But in his mind, another plan was already taking shape. This wasn't just a partnership opportunity. This was an opportunity to dominate the entire software industry. As soon as he left Apple's headquarters, Gates convened his own team of engineers. Microsoft needed to build its own graphical user interface, and they needed to do it before the Macintosh was released. The new project was codenamed Interface Manager. The goal was clear: to beat Apple at its own game. Gates wanted to create a product that not only competed with a Macintosh, but could also run on any IBM-compatible PC, not just on a single, expensive line of hardware. In November 1983, just a few weeks before the scheduled launch of the Macintosh, Bill Gates held a press event. He announced a revolutionary new operating system. Interface Manager had a new, more memorable name, one that would change the course of technology forever: Windows. When Steve Jobs heard the news, he was apoplectic. The technology he had poured his soul into for 3 years was no longer unique. But what enraged him most was not that Microsoft had copied his idea, but who had done it. Bill Gates, the man he had trusted as an ally, had now declared war. Jobs immediately summoned Gates to Apple's headquarters in Cupertino. Gates, never one to be intimidated, walked into the lion's den alone. Jobs was waiting for him in a conference room, flanked by 10 of his top executives. They were all eager to witness the showdown, like spectators at a prize fight. Jobs did not disappoint them. As soon as Gates entered, he erupted. "You're ripping us off," he screamed, his voice filled with fury. "I trusted you, and now you're stealing from us." The room fell silent. They knew Jobs would be angry, but the intensity of his rage was shocking. Gates remained calm. He sat quietly, his gaze fixed on Jobs, letting the storm of accusations wash over him. When Jobs finally paused for breath, Gates delivered his legendary reply, his voice cool and measured. "Well, Steve," he began, "I think there's more than one way to look at it. And I broke into his house to steal the TV set and found out that you had already stolen it." The air went out of the room. In that single, brilliant sentence, Gates had not only admitted to the theft, but had also reminded Jobs that he, too, had taken the idea from someone else. Jobs was outmaneuvered. From that moment on, the war between the two geniuses was official. The animosity spilled into the public domain. Jobs would later state bluntly, "They just ripped us off because Gates has no shame." Gates, in turn, would dismiss Jobs's claims with a shrug. If he believes that, he's really entered his own reality distortion field. The personal attacks grew sharper. Gates considered Jobs to be fundamentally odd, and weirdly flawed as a human being. Years later, in a 1996 PBS documentary called Triumph of the Nerds, Jobs did not hold back. He publicly blasted Microsoft's products as being third-rate and creatively bankrupt. The only problem with Microsoft, Jobs declared, is they just have no taste. They have absolutely no taste. And I don't mean that in a small way. I mean that in a big way. In the sense that they don't think of original ideas and they don't bring much culture into their products. It was a declaration of war, not just over technology, but over philosophy, over honor, and over the very soul of the personal computer. Part 4. The Reversal of Fortunes. Back in the early 1980s, Steve Jobs was betting everything on the Macintosh. To generate a massive wave of excitement, he didn't just plan a product launch. He orchestrated a cultural event. During the 1984 Super Bowl, Apple aired a stunning, dystopian-themed 1-minute commercial directed by the famed filmmaker Ridley Scott. The ad, inspired by George Orwell's novel 1984, showed a lone heroine smashing a giant screen, broadcasting the face of a big brother-like figure. It didn't show a single image of the computer itself, but its message was clear and powerful. On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. And then the day arrived. The Macintosh officially launched at a price of $2,495, equivalent to over $7,500 today. It was the most expensive personal computer on the market, but that didn't stop the initial rush. Over 72,000 Macintosh computers were sold in the first few months. Early adopters were enchanted by its intuitive interface and ease of use. A new generation of loyal users was born, and the cult of Mac officially began to form. But just a few months later, the dream began to crumble. The Macintosh was beautiful on the outside, but it had a fatal flaw on the inside. In his obsession with creating a silent, elegant machine, Jobs had insisted on removing the internal cooling fan. This caused the components to overheat, leading to frequent system crashes and hardware failures. The initial excitement wore off, replaced by frustration. A year after its celebrated launch, Macintosh sales plummeted. For the first time in its history, Apple reported a financial loss. But Jobs was undeterred. He continued to pour money and resources into the Macintosh project, largely ignoring the Apple II, which was still the company's primary source of revenue. This created a deep rift with Steve Wozniak. Wozniak felt that the company he had co-founded had lost its way, prioritizing style over substance. Disheartened, he decided to leave Apple, and Jobs lost his most important partner. On November 20th, 1985, Microsoft officially released the first version of Windows. While it was initially clunky and inferior to the Mac's operating system, it had two crucial advantages. It was cheap, and it could run on the vast ecosystem of IBM-compatible PCs. The market responded decisively. While Macintosh sales faltered, the number of PCs running Windows grew exponentially. With falling sales and declining profits, tensions within Apple reached a breaking point. The board of directors, led by the CEO John Sculley, whom Jobs himself had recruited, made an unthinkable decision. In a dramatic boardroom showdown, Steve Jobs was stripped of all his operational duties. He was effectively forced out of the very company he had created. He left Apple, carrying with him one of an immense and bitter defeat. In the years that followed, Apple drifted into a period of severe crisis. Without its visionary leader, the company lost its direction. Its product line became confusing and bloated. Its innovation stalled, and its stock price collapsed. Apple's global market share dwindled from a high of nearly 20% to a mere 3%. Meanwhile, Bill Gates reigned supreme. The launch of Windows 95 was a global phenomenon, selling over 100 million copies in its first year. At the age of 39, Bill Gates became the richest man in the world, with a fortune of over $12 billion. The personal computer was no longer a luxury. It was a fixture in homes and offices everywhere, and almost all of them ran Windows. In 1997, Apple was on the brink of bankruptcy. Steve Jobs, however, had not been idle. After leaving Apple, he founded a new company, Next, with the ambitious goal of building the world's most advanced computer and operating system. NXT was not a commercial success, but its software was brilliant, powerful, and far ahead of its time. In a desperate, last-ditch effort to save itself, Apple's board made a stunning move. They agreed to acquire Next for $429 million. But the real prize was not the technology. It was the man who came with it. Steve Jobs was coming home. He returned to Apple, first as an advisor, and soon after as interim CEO. He immediately took stock of the situation and realized it was far worse than he had imagined. Apple was hemorrhaging money and was only weeks away from insolvency. He knew there was only one person who could help him, and it was the last person anyone expected. In August 1997, Steve Jobs walked onto the stage at the Macworld conference. Thousands of Apple fans and employees waited with bated breath. After taking a sip of water, Jobs made his announcement. "I'd like to announce one of our first partnerships today," he said, "and that is one with Microsoft." A wave of confusion and boos rippled through the audience. And then, appearing on the giant screen behind Jobs, was the face of Bill Gates, live via satellite. The hall erupted. Steve Jobs, the man who had waged a holy war against Microsoft, was now announcing a partnership with his old nemesis. It seemed inexplicable, but in reality, it was a move of strategic genius for both sides. At the time, Microsoft was facing intense scrutiny from the U.S. Department of Justice. A massive antitrust lawsuit accused the company of stifling competition and crushing smaller rivals. Gates understood that if Apple, its only significant competitor in the operating system market, went bankrupt, Microsoft would truly be the last man standing. And that would be a disaster from a legal standpoint. It would be all the proof the government needed to break the company apart. A weak but surviving Apple was far more valuable to Microsoft than a dead Apple. And so, a deal was struck. Bill Gates agreed to invest $150 million in exchange for non-voting shares. He also committed to continuing the development of Microsoft Office for the Mac platform for the next 5 years. In essence, Gates wasn't saving Jobs, he was saving himself. But whatever the reason, the deal gave Apple a vital lifeline. And Steve Jobs knew exactly what to do with it. He immediately simplified Apple's product line, focusing on just a few key products. He brought in a new level of design excellence, driven by the philosophy that a computer should be beautiful and desirable. And so, the iMac was born. With its vibrant, translucent, colored case and a design that was built for the internet from the ground up, it was unlike any computer the world had ever seen. On August 15, 1998, the iMac was released. The market exploded. It sold 800,000 units in its first year, pulling Apple back from the brink of extinction. No one doubted it anymore. Apple was back, and Steve Jobs was just getting started. Over the next decade, Apple would release a string of revolutionary products that would not just dominate their markets, but create entirely new ones. The iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. Apple would become the most valuable company in the world. Part 5. Divergent Legacies. As Apple soared to unprecedented heights, Bill Gates' journey took a different turn. Microsoft remained a technology Goliath, but Gates faced a personal challenge. He was immensely successful, but he was not beloved. Steve Jobs was celebrated as a visionary artist, a cultural icon. Bill Gates was often portrayed as a ruthless monopolist, a cold and calculating businessman who had won through strategy, not through soul. Gates wanted a different legacy. He didn't just want to be remembered as the richest man in the world. He wanted to be remembered as a great man. In 2000, he stepped down as CEO of Microsoft and, with his wife Melinda, dedicated his life to philanthropy. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, launched with an initial endowment of billions, quickly became the largest private charitable organization in history. Gates poured his fortune and his formidable intellect into solving the world's most pressing problems, eradicating diseases, improving global health, and fighting poverty. Over time, the public image of the ruthless monopolist of the 1990s began to fade, replaced by the image of a global statesman, a man who was using his wealth to change the lives of millions. His perspective on Steve Jobs also softened, though it never lost its analytical edge. He never really knew much about technology, Gates would later reflect, but he had an amazing instinct for what works. Steve Jobs, for his part, remained fiercely critical, even after Gates had retired. Bill is basically unimaginative and has never invented anything, Jobs once said. He just shamelessly ripped off other people's ideas. But behind the public barbs, a quiet reconciliation was taking place. In the final months of Steve Jobs' life, as he battled cancer, Bill Gates visited him at his home in Palo Alto. They spent hours together, talking, not as rivals, but as two old veterans reflecting on their incredible journey. They talked about their families, about what they had built, and about the paths they had chosen. In 2011, Steve Jobs passed away. But the philosophy he championed, that technology should be simple, beautiful, and deeply human, continues to shape our world. In 2025, Apple stands as a titan with a market capitalization exceeding $3 trillion. Microsoft, under new leadership, but still bearing the imprint of Bill Gates, stands right alongside it, a fellow giant of the digital age. If Steve Jobs made the world fall in love with technology, Bill Gates gave that technology its soul, its universal language. They were allies. They were enemies. But in the end, they're two opposing forces, like two celestial bodies locked in a gravitational dance, created the digital universe we all inhabit today. There would be no Apple as we know it without Microsoft, and there would be no Microsoft as we know it without Apple. Two paths, two philosophies, two legends. But they shared one mission: to put a tool in our hands that could change our lives, and in doing so, move humanity forward. Thank you for joining me here at Thanh Labs. I hope this story has brought you some insight and a sense of calm. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support our channel. I wish you a deep and peaceful sleep. We'll meet again in our next story.